Okay, we are ready to start the very last, but certainly not least, session of SBC. And we are starting with my dear colleague Lioba Heimbach, and she's going to be presenting her empirical research on multiple sides of 36 coins. Take it away.
Thank you, Dionysus, for the introduction. So yes, I'm going to be presenting our paper, Multiple Sides of 36 Coins, and it's a measurement study of peer-to-peer infrastructure across cryptocurrencies. So I'm Lioba Heimbach, I'm from Category Labs, and this is joint work with Lucianna Kiffer, Dennis Trautwein, Yann Vonlanthen, and Oliver Gasser. So let's get started. Like when users normally interact with a blockchain or hear about blockchains, what they tend to see is maybe a token price, a market cap. Now when they're actually using the blockchain, maybe they go to a block explorer, look at some blocks, look at some transactions, and they have some exposure to like the apps and DeFi things that they might be using. But there's something sort of that is holding this all together from underneath, and that is the peer-to-peer network, which essentially carries every transaction, block, and consensus message. And generally, for most blockchain networks, this is really a hidden layer. There's very little information out there about like how big these networks are, where the nodes in them are located, and so on. But fundamentally, like the security, decentralization, and censorship resistance of these blockchain networks really relies on this layer. So what we set out to do is essentially do a large-scale measurement study of cryptocurrency peer-to-peer networks. In total, in this study, we measured 36 blockchain networks, so the peer-to-peer networks they have. For the data in this paper, it was for a little more than 9 months. We started running our measurements in December 2024, but they are still running today. So now they've been running for more than a year, and I'll show you at the end. There you can go and look at sort of the data that we're still collecting, and there's a live website. And essentially, to do our measurements, what we do is we do them on IPv4 and IPv6. They're done with daily crawls and hourly measurements, but more on that later. So first, I'm going to start by talking a bit about how peer discovery essentially works. So if I want to become a node in one of these networks, essentially, how do I find peers to talk to? So this is me. I'm a node. My peer table is empty. I don't know anyone else in this network yet. What do I do? Well, generally, there is like a boot node that is maintained by, for example, a client team, a foundation, or whatever. And I can go there and I can get like some initial starting list of peers, essentially. OK, so now I have a bit more peers that I know about. What I do now is, I can ask one of them for their peer table. They send me back some more peers sort of for me to add to my peer list. And essentially, my peer list or my peer table is then like a running list that I can draw new connections from when I need them. And yeah, essentially, when you want to crawl a network, what you do is you just keep iterating over every peer until you no longer learn about new peers. So you go from each peer that you know about, ask them about their peers, until you've enumerated the entire network. So the way that this peer discovery is implemented, in particular the way that the nodes actually share their peers, it's quite different by blockchains. There are quite a small amount of blockchains that actually, they just return you all active peers. So when you go to a node and ask it for its peers, it just sends you the entire list. This is quite rare, but it actually also exposes like the real topology, because they give you all their current live connections. So this is the case for those that we measured for Ripple, Avalanche, and Near. Then there's these are like generally the Bitcoin family of networks that in their peer tables, there's so tens of thousands of nodes. And then each day, essentially, they return a cached 1K sample. And that's refreshed every 24 hours. So if you ask them on a day, they will always give you the same answer. So this is like the Bitcoin network generally. Bitcoin, Dogecoin, Bitcoin Cash, Litecoin, and Stellar. And then there's the distributed hash tables ones. And essentially, for them, what they return you is like 160 neighbors by the XOR distance, and essentially those close to a queried key that you give them. So those are essentially the Ethereum ones generally, or like that have close implementations to Ethereum, and most of them use one library, which is libpeer-to-peer. So here we have Ethereum, Polkadot, Filecoin, Celestia, and a Veil network that we were measuring. So what we then do is essentially we do a crawl every 24 hours. So that's a full crawl of the network. We go to each node, ask it for its peers until we no longer hear about new peers. And then every hour, we check for whether these nodes are still active. So we do an in-protocol ping and a TCP ping to essentially know about every node. In total, we have 14 custom crawlers that are running. And we also added Solana through an external crawler, but we did the hourly pings ourselves. OK. So what are we discovering, essentially, when we're asking about the peers from these nodes? Like, what is the proportion of active and discovered nodes that we're getting returned? So yeah, essentially now on the slide, what you can see is for the networks that we were crawling, you can see the active IPs and the discovered ones. When you go to the first line in the table, that's Bitcoin. And essentially for Bitcoin, we discovered more than 250 IPs, but only around 11,000 of them were active. So the active to discovered ratio is very low. It's 4%. And essentially for all the Bitcoin-based networks, generally they store a lot of noise in their tables. Like these are nodes that are no longer alive for quite some time. Then for the DHT networks, it's a bit the opposite almost. Like, for example, if you go to Polkadot, we discovered around 9,386 IPs, and of those, 9,151 were actually active. So they have much cleaner tables, these networks. Then also, something to just mention, we are crawling or measuring on both IPv4 and IPv6, but these networks almost entirely run on IPv4. There's like some, especially for the Bitcoin-based ones, where like maybe 10 to 15% are running on IPv6. OK, so let's look at these peer tables that we're getting back, like how big they are and how easily we can enumerate the network with them. So I'm showing on the slides essentially like median values. So median values for table size, the number of active peers in a table, as well as sort of the median proportion of the network we cover with like a single table. And what you can see is that the median size of these tables, it really spans by an order of magnitude. So for Avalanche, we get more than 1,200 peers returned. So recall, this is one of the networks that really just sends you all the peers. And for Ripple on the like other extreme, we only get 19 peers on as a median per peer table that we get. So then looking a bit more in the details of like the proportion of the network that we cover, or to ask it a bit differently, like how many tables do we need to cover the entire network? This is what is shown on this slide now. And essentially it shows you like the coverage of the active network you get with sort of the number of tables that you need to get to that coverage. So for Avalanche, like the first table, the best one that you get essentially reaches already around 75% of the entire network. And with 4 tables, you have enumerated the entire network. Bitcoin is sort of like on the other extreme. There we needed 1,278 tables to enumerate the entire network. And also like the Ethereum networks. So Ethereum actually runs 2 peer-to-peer networks, the disk v4 for the execution clients and the disk v5 for the consensus clients. It's around 600, for example, that you need to cover the entire network. OK. Now, I already hinted at this a bit, but Ethereum has 2 networks, the disk v4 and the disk v5. More importantly, or like to add on to that, the disk v4 network is actually a shared network. So there's one discovery layer that's used by many chains. Essentially, when you're measuring the Ethereum disk v4 network, you are measuring an additional 19 more networks on top of that automatically. Some examples are Binance, Genesis, Polygon, Ethereum Classic, for example. And most of the nodes, essentially, that are in these disk v4 tables, they're not Ethereum mainnet nodes. They may be a testnet nodes or one of these other networks that I was mentioning. Now, the same also holds for the disk v5 Ethereum network. So this is the consensus discovery layer for Ethereum. Here, however, we don't really get as many other networks. It's mainly Ethereum, Geonosis, and some test nets on top of that. But this really gives us like a second independent view of the Ethereum network. Now there's a final shared discovery layer that we have in our study. Essentially, the Bitcoin-based clients, they used a network magic number to separate the messages, so to separate their discovery layers essentially. But when Bitcoin Cash forked off, some more forked off of Bitcoin Cash, and they kept the magic number the same. So by measuring Bitcoin Cash, you're also measuring the peer-to-peer network of Bitcoin SV and eCash as well. So there's 2 more networks that we're passively measuring here. OK. So what I've presented so far is the measurements that we're doing with a crawler. But creating a crawler can be quite time-intensive. Like a full crawler needs like network-specific engineering. Some networks might not have any decentralized peer discovery and so on. So as part of this work, we also wanted to see like what are some other ways in which you can potentially like measure a peer-to-peer network. And what we tried is essentially doing an IP-wide scan. So you send one handshake message through an IP port combination and see who answers. And then we had some ground truth for Bitcoin, because that's one of the networks we crawled, and we saw like how similar essentially the results of these 2 measurement methodologies are. So on our IP-wide scan for Bitcoin, we get around 430,000 connections. Out of those, we get 207,000 responses, mostly errors though. We get around 9,500 syntactically valid responses to the handshake message, and of those, around 9,100 actually have the correct version number. So how does this compare to the crawl that we did on the same day? Well, actually, there's a quite significant overlap between 2, and the network size is more or less similar. Note that we were only doing this measurement on the most widely used ports, so some of the differences might also stem from that. And this seems to be like one methodology you can also use to crawl a network, well, to measure networks without actually like having to crawl it. And one more network that we were able to add through this to our study is Cardano. It doesn't have a distributed peer discovery. And so we used this one handcrafted handshake, did an IP-wide scan. This is for IPv4. And our scan essentially finds 1,700 nodes. And this is relatively close, even though not exactly, at the 1,300 that the Cardano Foundation API was returning for the peer count that day. So really, IP scanning can size a network with no crawler being involved at all, quite accurately. OK. So I think with that, this is more or less everything on the methodology, on how we were measuring these networks, now more on how these networks actually look. So they vary enormously in size. Like there are some networks that have, these are median figures, like daily medians essentially, aggregated for each network. There are some that have around 11,000 nodes in them, and others have under 10 essentially. And really, there's a bit of a long tail, so most of them have less than 1,000 nodes. Another observation just to make is that the size doesn't really track value. Value here is just market cap, but there's some chains that are really securing billions that really run on a few dozen nodes only. So that's like the underlying peer-to-peer layer that is securing the network. Then another question you might naturally ask is, where are they running from, like in terms of geography, in terms of hosting, and what is the concentration there? Well, I think one thing, if you've done any sort of blockchain measurement study, you will find it's always a quite concentrated. The answer is always that it's concentrated. For these peer-to-peer networks, what you see in terms of geography is that around 50% of them run from either the US or Germany. So that's from all active IPs across all the networks that we were measuring. And the top 9 countries hold over 80% of all nodes, essentially. This split between Europe and North America, with a really high concentration in particular the US and Germany, It is quite common across many networks. So you see it for Bitcoin, for example, but you also see it for Ethereum. Ethereum, in comparison to Bitcoin, is maybe a bit more East Coast heavy within the US, but otherwise it's this general split that most of these networks have. But some are different. Like Near, for example, leans quite Europe heavy, and Filecoin, on the other hand, leans quite Asia heavy. So there are some differences by network, but for most of them, it's this general trend that is very heavy on North America and Europe. Now, the other thing we looked at in terms of concentration is also like how the networks are distributed across autonomous systems. So for that, we looked at the HHI. Essentially, the higher the HHI is, the more concentrated a network is. And what we find here is that really it is concentrated in a few ASs for some of the chains, like Near, Solana, Stellar, Avalanche, Ripple. They have a pretty high concentration in terms of like ASs, while it's very well spread for some others, like Bitcoin, Polkadot, Filecoin, Celestia, and Avail. I think sort of the general takeaway here is that these networks are generally more concentrated when they're either small or rely heavily on data centers. So you have to have very powerful nodes to run them. Bitcoin, for example, it's very lightweight to run a node, and that is quite well spread. And it's a large network on top of that. OK, another thing that we wanted to look at is how stable are these networks, or how much churn is there in a network. Do I see the same 100 nodes or 1,000 nodes that run every day, or is there like rapid churn or like quite significant churn? And what we find is that the daily retention is pretty high. So the median retention across all networks is essentially, for most of them, way above 90%. The lowest are Dogecoin and Litecoin. They sit under 95% of daily retention. So that means that less than 95% of the nodes on today were there yesterday, essentially. What you can also see in these plots is that the upper tail, it cuts below 100. So there's like a straight line below 100%, essentially. And that means that there's like some sort of baseline for daily churn. This is likely due to IP rotation, for example, or hints at something along those lines. Now, the churn, it's pretty small on a daily basis, as we saw, but it really compounds over time. So now you can see here on the slide, essentially, is like how the churn compounds over time for a 16-day period. And what we find is that over 2 weeks, essentially, fewer than half of the Bitcoin, Litecoin, Dogecoin, and Ethereum disk V5, that again is the consensus layer network for Ethereum, actually stay online. And there's a small daily churn, essentially, we have in these networks, but it compounds to a pretty large turnover on like the magnitude of 2 weeks. OK, so the final thing that I'm going to show you in terms of like what our measurements resulted in, or like what our measurements were able to reveal, is how much cross-network overlap there is. So that just means I'm looking at an IP, I see a node for one IP, for one network running from that IP. Are there also like nodes for other networks running on them? Now, the first thing you will notice, essentially, in the top left of this figure, is that there's a very high overlap for the Ethereum disk V4 and the Ethereum disk V5 networks. That's the execution and consensus layer networks of Ethereum. The overlap here is around 50%, and this is also very much expected, because to follow the Ethereum chain, you need to run a node in both networks, essentially, and you might as well do it from the same IP. Now, for the Bitcoin family chains, we also see a pretty large crossover, essentially, or pretty large overlap. So they share around 20 to 35% of their IPs. Like one example you can see is like essentially in the first column here, which is the overlap with Bitcoin. You can see that a lot of the Dogecoin, Bitcoin Cash, and Litecoin nodes are also in the Bitcoin network. There's one clear outlier that we have here, and that outlier is Solana. For Solana, there's under 1% overlap with any other networks. So that means that if you're running a Solana node from an IP, it's very, very unlikely that you're also running another node, essentially, from that same IP. OK. So I think with that, let's wrap it up. So essentially, what we did in this study is we wanted to bring some light to this generally understudied and hidden layer. So we did measurements of 36 blockchain networks, and what we found is that the discovery layers essentially of these networks, they're oftentimes shared in the case of the Ethereum networks, for example, and they're oftentimes very noisy in the case of the Bitcoin networks, for example, like the Bitcoin family ones. We also found that IP scanning can be a cheap alternative. So I think personally it's very important for us to know more information about these networks, have the data actually. So maybe IP scanning is the way to go if we don't want to, for every network, create custom crawlers. And finally, and probably unsurprisingly, these networks are pretty uneven in size, and they're quite concentrated in terms of geography and hosting. So as I mentioned at the beginning of the talk, these measurements, they're still running today. The observatory is live. You can go there. You can check out sort of the daily number of active peers for the networks that we're still crawling. And you can also see the geographical distribution, for instance. So yes, this paper was also presented at Sigmetrics a couple of weeks ago, and there's a link to the paper as well as the observatory. Thanks.
Okay, thank you, Lioba. Please line up to the microphones for your questions. We have a little bit of time for questions. As you line up, I have a first question for Lioba. So you showed us some distribution on autonomous systems and also geography, but I'm wondering, do you have some idea about the controlling entities or how they fall under controlling entities such as Amazon's AWS? Is the distribution similar to autonomous systems HHI, or could it be that one entity controls multiple of them?
Yeah, I think generally if you have a very concentrated concentration in terms of HHIs, it's also quite concentrated in terms of that there's a lot in the same Amazon data center.
What about the other way? If it's under Amazon predominantly, could it have a low indicator here?
No, I think that it goes in both ways, I believe, at least to a very large extent. That is how these networks are. And yeah, it maps quite neatly.
Okay. And if there's no other questions, I want to ask one more, which is that I'm wondering if the Tor network can actually be used for peer discovery so as to thwart your attacks on scanning IP addresses. Do you think that would be something that could maybe increase the privacy of the peer-to-peer network? And does anybody do this today?
Yes, I mean, maybe something to note for Bitcoin, actually a quite non-small proportion runs over Tor, and they are not part of these measurements. So this is the IPv4 and IPv6 part of those networks. And especially for the Bitcoin family ones, there is quite some that are running through Tor, and yeah, we are not covering them.
Cool. What would it take for an adversary to attack the peer discovery process so that newly joined node is misled into, say, a fully malicious network?
Yes. Well, there's quite a bit of work on these Eclipse attacks, or where they are really focusing on that. What does it take for them? Well, it's different by the types, the peer discovery that you're using, essentially. But in general, you just want to fill a lot of peer tables with your nodes. There's very much different reputation systems for peers, some you repeatedly replace peers and so on. So yeah, sorry for not giving a very concrete answer, but I think the high-level answer is very much depends on the network. But probably the smaller the network is, the easier it is. If you have a huge network, it's going to be harder to essentially fill all the tables with the adversary's nodes.
All right, let's thank Lioba again.
Thank you.